30 years ago, on October 14, 1964, Jake and Sam Morrison disappeared after finishing their daily ranch work, leaving no trace behind and plunging their family into a nightmare that would consume 3 decades of their lives. The two brothers, aged 34 and 32, were pillars of their small Montana community, hard-working cattlemen whose handshake was worth more than any written contract. Their sudden vanishing sent shockwaves through the tight-knit ranching community and left their family shattered. Before continuing, subscribe, like this video, and hit the bell. This helps the channel bring more stories like this one. The Morrison Ranch stretched across 2,000 acres of prime Montana grassland, a legacy built by their grandfather in the 1890s. Jake, the elder brother, had taken over the family business with the steady confidence of a man born to work the land. Sam, younger but equally devoted, handled the cattle operations with an almost mystical understanding of the animals. Together, they had built the ranch into one of the most respected operations in the county. October 14th began like any other autumn day. The brothers rose before dawn, their breath visible in the crisp morning air, as they prepared for another day of moving cattle to winter pastures. Martha Morrison, their 68-year-old mother, watched from the kitchen window as her sons walked toward the barn, their silhouettes disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. It would be the last time she would see them alive. Emma Morrison, then 28 and the youngest of the siblings, lived in town but visited the ranch daily to help with bookkeeping. She arrived that afternoon to find her mother pacing anxiously on the front porch. The brothers should have returned hours ago for their midday meal, a ritual they had never broken in all their years of ranching. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and crimson, fear crept into the Morrison household. Jake and Sam's horses had returned to the barn without their riders, still saddled and nervous. Their truck sat in its usual spot. Nothing had been taken from the house or barn. It was as if the two men had simply vanished into the vast Montana wilderness. Emma drove into town to alert the sheriff, her hands trembling on the steering wheel as worst-case scenarios played through her mind. Sheriff Robert Hayes, a family friend for over 20 years, initially suggested the brothers might have gotten injured while checking distant fence lines. But as the hours turned to days and organized search parties combed every inch of the ranch and surrounding wilderness, it became clear that something far more sinister had occurred. The search efforts were extensive by 1964 standards. Neighbors abandoned their own harvest work to join the search. Helicopters from the state police scoured the landscape. Bloodhounds followed scent trails that led to the main road and then disappeared completely. After 2 weeks of intensive searching, the official investigation began to wind down, leaving the Morrison family with nothing but questions and an unbearable silence. Martha Morrison aged years in those first few weeks. The vibrant woman who had raised 3 children and helped build a ranch empire became a shadow of herself, spending hours staring out at the empty fields where her sons had worked. Emma took leave from her teaching job in town to stay at the ranch, but the vast property felt hollow without Jake and Sam's presence. The cattle still needed tending, but hired hands could never fill the void left by the Morrison brothers. As autumn turned to winter, the case began to fade from public attention. Sheriff Hayes assured the family that the investigation remained active, but Emma could see the writing on the wall. Without bodies, without witnesses, without any concrete evidence of foul play, the disappearance of Jake and Sam Morrison was destined to become another unsolved mystery filed away in a dusty cabinet. But Martha Morrison refused to accept that fate. Every Sunday after church, she would corner Sheriff Hayes or his deputies demanding updates that never came. She hired a private investigator with money from the ranch's savings, but he found no more answers than the police had. The old woman's faith never wavered. She believed her sons were out there somewhere waiting to come home. The winter of 1964 descended upon the Morrison Ranch like a shroud of silence, each snowfall burying hope a little deeper, while the family struggled to maintain both their sanity and their livelihood. Sheriff Hayes had officially declared the case inactive by Christmas, citing lack of evidence and exhausted leads, but for Martha and Emma Morrison, the investigation had only just begun. Emma Morrison transformed from a small-town schoolteacher into a relentless seeker of truth. She spent her evenings poring over every detail of that fateful October day, creating timelines and maps, interviewing neighbors and ranch hands repeatedly. Her methodical approach revealed disturbing inconsistencies in witness statements and glaring oversights in the police investigation. The first major revelation came from an unexpected source. Tommy Rodriguez, a teenage ranch hand who had been too intimidated to speak during the initial investigation, finally approached Emma in February 1965. With nervous hands and a shaking voice, he revealed that he had seen an unfamiliar black sedan parked on the dirt road bordering the Morrison property on the morning of October 14th. The car had been there for hours, its occupants hidden behind tinted windows, watching the ranch activities. When Emma brought this information to Sheriff Hayes, his reaction was dismissive and oddly defensive. He claimed that dozens of cars passed that road daily and that a 4-month-old sighting was hardly credible evidence. But Emma noticed something troubling in the sheriff's demeanor, a reluctance to document Tommy's statement and an eagerness to end the conversation. For the first time, she began to suspect that the investigation's failures might not be due to incompetence alone. Martha Morrison's grief had evolved into something harder and more dangerous: suspicion. The 69-year-old woman had begun paying attention to conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, to the uncomfortable glances exchanged by longtime family friends, to the way certain neighbors avoided eye contact at church. Her intuition, sharpened by decades of reading cattle and weather patterns, told her that someone in their close-knit community knew more than they were admitting. The ranch struggled financially through that first winter without Jake and Sam. The brothers had been more than laborers. They were the heart and soul of the operation, possessing an intuitive understanding of cattle behavior and land management that couldn't be easily replaced. Emma found herself learning ranch management by necessity, rising before dawn to check on cattle and falling into bed exhausted each night, her mind still racing with questions about her brother's fate. Spring brought no relief, only fresh reminders of loss. The pastures where Jake and Sam had planned to expand the cattle operation remained empty. The new barn they had been discussing never got built. Worst of all, their mother's health began to decline rapidly. Martha Morrison, who had once been strong enough to help brand cattle, now struggled to walk from the house to the mailbox. It was during this period that Emma made a disturbing discovery. While organizing her brother's personal belongings, she found a series of cryptic notes in Jake's handwriting, hidden in his desk drawer. The notes referenced the agreement, dangerous territory, and keeping quiet for everyone's sake. Most chilling was a final entry dated just 3 days before the disappearance. "Sam's getting nervous, thinks we should tell someone, but who can we trust?" Emma brought the notes to the new sheriff who had replaced Hayes after his sudden retirement in early 1965. Sheriff Patricia Coleman was an outsider, brought in from the state capital, and Emma hoped for a fresh perspective. But Coleman's response was equally frustrating. She suggested the notes might refer to perfectly innocent business dealings and warned Emma against reading too much into ambiguous scribbles. The community's attitude toward the Morrison family had begun to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Old friends became distant. Business associates who had once competed for the brothers' attention now seemed reluctant to discuss them at all. Even the local newspaper, which had initially covered the disappearance extensively, stopped mentioning the case entirely. By the summer of 1965, Emma had compiled a thick folder of inconsistencies, witness statements, and unanswered questions. She had identified several community members whose behavior had changed dramatically after the disappearance. She had documented the rushed closure of the official investigation and the suspicious retirement of Sheriff Hayes, but without concrete evidence or support from law enforcement, she felt like she was fighting shadows. Martha Morrison's condition continued to deteriorate. The doctors spoke of heart problems and stress, but Emma knew her mother was simply dying of a broken heart. The old woman spent her days in Jake's favorite chair by the window, staring out at the fields where her sons should have been working. She spoke to them as if they were still there, asking about cattle prices and weather predictions, maintaining conversations with ghosts. As the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, Emma made a decision that would define the next 3 decades of her life. She would never stop searching for the truth about Jake and Sam Morrison. She would document every inconsistency, interview every potential witness, and follow every lead, no matter how long it took. The community might want to forget, law enforcement might want to move on, but the Morrison family would never surrender. Years passed like seasons on the Montana plains. inevitable, relentless, and marked by the steady erosion of hope. By 1970, 5 years after Jake and Sam Morrison's disappearance, their story had faded from community consciousness, but Emma Morrison's determination had only grown stronger. She had transformed her brother's disappearance into a methodical, solitary crusade for truth. Emma had developed an intricate system for tracking information. Her small apartment in town had become a makeshift investigation headquarters, walls covered with maps, timelines, and photographs. She had learned to think like a detective, to question everything, and to trust no one completely. The cheerful schoolteacher had evolved into something harder and more focused, a woman shaped by loss and driven by an unshakable belief that truth would eventually surface. The ranch had been sold in 1968. Martha Morrison's declining health and the property's association with tragedy made it impossible to maintain. The new owners, a corporation from back east, had renovated the main house and modernized the cattle operations, but they had left one structure untouched, the old barn where Jake and Sam had last been seen alive. Something about the building made workers uncomfortable, and several had reported strange feelings when working near it. Martha Morrison passed away in her sleep on a cold February morning in 1971, 7 years after her son's disappearance. She died clutching a photograph of Jake and Sam at a county fair, their faces young and confident under their cowboy hats. Emma found her mother's journal hidden beneath her mattress, filled with daily conversations addressed to her missing sons, documenting a mother's refusal to accept loss. The funeral was sparsely attended. Many of the family's oldest friends had drifted away over the years, uncomfortable with the persistent questions and the shadow of unsolved mystery. But Emma noticed something significant about those who did attend. Their relief was palpable. Several longtime community members seemed genuinely happy that Martha Morrison's vigil was finally over, that her accusations and suspicions were buried with her. After her mother's death, Emma doubled down on her investigation. She had inherited a small life insurance payout, which she used to hire private investigators and forensic experts. She learned about advances in criminal investigation techniques and began corresponding with detectives from other states who had solved cold cases. Her letters to the FBI requesting assistance went unanswered, but she continued to document everything. The late 1970s brought new technology and new possibilities. Emma learned about fingerprint analysis, improved photography techniques, and early computer databases. She began to understand that evidence she couldn't analyze in 1964 might yield answers in the modern era. But without access to the original crime scene or official cooperation, her options remained limited. It was during this period that Emma began to notice patterns in the community's behavior that she had missed earlier. Certain families had experienced unusual prosperity after 1964. Sheriff Hayes, who had retired so abruptly, had purchased a ranch in Arizona with money that seemed to exceed his law enforcement salary. 3 prominent businessmen who had known her brothers well had all left Montana within 5 years of the disappearance. Emma's investigation had also revealed troubling information about land deals and water rights in the area. The Morrison Ranch had sat on prime grazing land with access to a year-round stream, valuable assets in Montana's arid climate. She discovered that several attempts had been made to purchase portions of the ranch in the months before her brother's disappearance, offers that Jake and Sam had firmly rejected. The most disturbing revelation came from an unexpected source, a deathbed confession. In 1979, a ranch hand named Pete Sullivan, dying of lung cancer, called Emma to his hospital bedside. With his family present, he admitted that he had been paid to provide false information to investigators about the brothers' activities on their last day. He had been threatened with violence if he revealed the truth, but approaching death had freed him from fear. Sullivan's confession was tantalizing but incomplete. He admitted that the brothers had discovered something that certain people wanted kept secret, but claimed he didn't know the specific details. He confirmed that their disappearance was not random. It was planned and executed by people they trusted. Most significantly, he revealed that evidence of the crime still existed, hidden somewhere on the original ranch property. Emma brought Sullivan's confession to the current sheriff, but was met with familiar skepticism. Without corroborating evidence or living witnesses, the deathbed statement was legally meaningless. But for Emma, it confirmed what she had suspected for 15 years. Her brothers had been murdered by people they knew, and the truth was still within reach. As the 1980s began, Emma Morrison was approaching 50, her hair prematurely grey, her face lined by years of stress and determination. She had never married, never had children, never built a life beyond her search for answers. Friends worried about her obsession, but Emma knew that abandoning the investigation would mean betraying not just her brother's memory, but her mother's faith and her own sense of justice. She had compiled hundreds of pages of notes, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and identified multiple suspects. She had uncovered evidence of corruption, land fraud, and conspiracy. But she still lacked the one thing that could bring her brothers home, proof of what had happened to them on that October day in 1964. The 1980s brought subtle changes to the Montana landscape, where Jake and Sam Morrison had once worked their family ranch. Corporate agriculture was replacing family operations, new technologies were transforming rural life, and the tight-knit communities of the Old West were slowly giving way to modern anonymity. But for Emma Morrison, now in her 50s, time had frozen on October 14, 1964. Emma had evolved into something unprecedented in their rural community, a female private investigator driven by personal loss and an uncompromising sense of justice. She had taught herself forensic techniques, criminal psychology, and investigative methodology. Her small apartment had become a repository of evidence that would have impressed professional detectives, if any had been willing to take her seriously. The ranch property had changed hands twice since the Morrison family's forced sale. The current owners, an agricultural corporation called Western Plains Development, had modernized most of the structures but had left the original barn standing. Local workers still reported strange feelings about the building, and several had quit rather than work near it. Emma had always found this significant. Animals and sensitive people often react to places where violence has occurred. Through patient cultivation of sources, Emma had developed a network of informants throughout the county. Bartenders, postal workers, bank employees, and retired law enforcement officers all provided pieces of a puzzle that was slowly coming into focus. She had learned that the weeks before Jake and Sam's disappearance had been marked by increased activity among certain community members, closed-door meetings, unusual financial transactions, and nervous behavior. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source: geological surveys. Emma had discovered that the Morrison Ranch sat atop a significant underground water source, far more valuable than anyone had realized in 1964. As Montana's climate became increasingly arid, water rights had become worth millions of dollars. Companies throughout the Southwest were quietly acquiring properties with underground water access, sometimes using questionable methods. Emma's investigation revealed that Western Plains Development had been attempting to purchase Morrison water rights for years before the brothers' disappearance. Jake and Sam had repeatedly refused to sell, understanding that water was the foundation of their ranch's long-term viability. The brothers had also discovered that someone was illegally tapping into their underground aquifer, stealing water that legally belonged to the Morrison family. The pieces were beginning to form a coherent picture. Jake and Sam Morrison had been killed because they had discovered a water theft operation and threatened to expose it. The conspiracy had involved local officials, law enforcement, and business leaders who had profited from illegal water rights sales. The brothers' disappearance had been carefully planned and executed to look like an accident or voluntary departure, but Emma still lacked physical evidence. She needed to prove that her brothers were dead, identify their killers, and locate their remains. After 25 years of investigation, she was convinced that the answers lay somewhere on the original ranch property. The problem was gaining access to conduct a proper search without alerting potential conspirators. Emma's opportunity came in 1989, when Western Plains Development faced financial difficulties and put the property up for sale. Using her mother's life insurance money and a loan secured against her own home, Emma made an offer to purchase a small section of the ranch, specifically the area around the old barn that workers found so disturbing. The negotiations were complicated and suspicious. Western Plains seemed reluctant to sell even a small portion of the property, despite their financial problems. Emma's lawyer detected attempts to delay the sale and inflate the price beyond her means. But Emma persisted, eventually securing a deal that gave her ownership of 50 acres surrounding the original Morrison homestead. Taking possession of the land felt like coming home after a quarter-century of exile. Emma walked the familiar pastures where she had helped her brothers move cattle stood in the kitchen where her mother had prepared thousands of meals, and finally entered the barn where Jake and Sam had last been seen alive. The building felt heavy with secrets, as if the very air held memories of violence. Emma began her search methodically, using ground-penetrating radar equipment she had learned to operate through correspondence courses. She examined every inch of the barn's interior, looking for disturbed soil, unusual construction, or hidden spaces. She tested the ground around the building for chemical residues that might indicate decomposition or attempts to destroy evidence. Her most significant discovery came from studying the barn's construction history. County records showed that extensive renovations had been completed in December 1964, just 2 months after her brother's disappearance. The work had been done quickly and quietly by a construction crew from out of state. Most intriguingly, the renovations had included significant work on the barn's foundation and floor. Emma realized that the answer to her 25-year search might lie literally beneath her feet. If Jake and Sam Morrison had been killed and their bodies hidden, the most logical location would be somewhere on the family property, concealed beneath construction that had occurred immediately after their disappearance. The barn's mysterious atmosphere, the workers' discomfort, and the timing of the renovations all pointed to one conclusion. Her brothers were buried beneath the building where they had last been seen alive. But proving this theory would require excavation, which meant potentially destroying evidence if she proceeded incorrectly. Emma knew she had one chance to uncover the truth. She would need to plan carefully, document everything, and prepare for the possibility that what she found might finally bring justice for Jake and Sam Morrison, or confirm that some secrets were meant to stay buried. 30 years after Jake and Sam Morrison vanished from their family ranch, the truth lay hidden beneath layers of concrete and decades of carefully maintained silence. Emma Morrison, now 58 years old, and the sole keeper of her family's tragic history, had spent 3 decades preparing for the moment when she would finally uncover what happened to her brothers. That moment came on a storm-lashed night in October 1994, delivered not by her careful investigation, but by an act of nature that would expose secrets buried for a generation. If this case has already captivated you, leave a like. It helps the channel bring more stories like this one, and helps Jake and Sam Morrison's story reach more people. Lightning had been dancing across the Montana sky all evening, illuminating the vast plains in stroboscopic flashes. Emma was in her small cabin on the property she had repurchased, reviewing notes and preparing for another day of methodical investigation, when the first bolt struck the old Morrison barn. The structure, built in the 1920s and renovated under suspicious circumstances in 1964, erupted in flames that could be seen for miles across the prairie. The volunteer fire department arrived within an hour, but the building was already beyond saving. Emma stood in the rain, watching 30 years of carefully preserved evidence being consumed by flames, feeling as though fate was mocking her lifelong search for answers. The barn had been the focal point of her investigation, the place where she was certain her brother's secrets lay hidden. Now it was being reduced to ash and charred timber, but as the fire burned through the night, something extraordinary happened. The intense heat and the collapse of the wooden flooring exposed something that had been hidden since 1964, a concrete basement that appeared on no official building plans. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, Emma could see steel reinforcing bars protruding from a carefully constructed underground chamber that should not have existed. Emma immediately contacted the sheriff's department, knowing that any evidence discovered would need official documentation to be legally valid. Sheriff Maria Gonzalez, who had taken office 2 years earlier, arrived with a team of investigators and representatives from the State Crime Laboratory. Unlike her predecessors, Gonzalez had no connection to the events of 1964 and approached the discovery with professional objectivity. The excavation of the hidden basement took 3 days. As workers carefully removed debris and ash, the scope of what had been concealed became clear. The chamber was approximately 12 feet square and 8 feet deep, with thick concrete walls and a reinforced ceiling that had supported the barn floor for 3 decades. It had been built like a tomb, designed to keep its contents hidden forever. Inside the chamber, investigators made discoveries that validated Emma's 30-year investigation. They found personal belongings that Martha Morrison immediately identified as belonging to her missing sons: Jake's distinctive belt buckle, Sam's wristwatch, and work clothes that bore their initials. More significantly, they discovered skeletal remains that forensic examination would later confirm belonged to two adult males consistent with the ages Jake and Sam would have been in 1964. The forensic evidence told a brutal story. Both men had died from gunshot wounds to the back of the head, execution-style killings that indicated they had been murdered by someone they trusted enough to turn their backs on. The positioning of the remains suggested they had been killed elsewhere and then transported to the basement, which had been constructed specifically to hide their bodies. Among the artifacts in the chamber, investigators found something that would transform Emma's theories into criminal evidence: a leather portfolio containing documents that exposed the water rights conspiracy Emma had suspected for years. The papers detailed illegal water extraction operations, forged property transfers, and bribery of local officials. Most damning were records showing that Jake and Sam Morrison had been investigating the conspiracy and had gathered evidence that could have sent several prominent community members to prison. The documents named names. Sheriff Robert Hayes, who had handled the original investigation, had been receiving monthly payments from Western Plains Development. 3 county commissioners had approved illegal water permits in exchange for substantial bribes. A network of businessmen and ranchers had been systematically stealing water rights from family operations throughout the region, using intimidation and, when necessary, murder to protect their scheme. Emma realized that Jake and Sam hadn't simply stumbled upon the conspiracy. They had been actively investigating it. Her brothers had been killed not because they had accidentally discovered something, but because they had been methodically gathering evidence to expose a criminal enterprise that had operated for years. The leather portfolio represented their investigation, preserved by their killers as insurance against potential accomplices. The discovery transformed Emma from a grieving sister pursuing a cold case into a key witness in an active criminal investigation. The evidence from the hidden basement would eventually lead to arrests, trials, and convictions of several individuals who had escaped justice for 30 years. But for Emma, the most important discovery was the confirmation that her brothers had died as heroes, fighting corruption and standing up for what was right. As investigators continued their work in the burned-out barn, Emma finally understood why her 30-year search had been necessary. Jake and Sam Morrison hadn't just vanished. They had been silenced because they had threatened to expose a conspiracy that reached into every level of local government and business. Their deaths had been part of a cover-up that had protected criminals for 3 decades. The fire that had seemed to destroy her last hope for answers had instead revealed the truth that her brothers had died trying to expose. In death, Jake and Sam Morrison would finally achieve the justice they had been seeking in life. The discovery of Jake and Sam Morrison's remains in the hidden basement beneath their family barn sent shockwaves through the Montana community that had harbored their killers for 30 years. What had begun as a tragic disappearance in 1964 was now revealed as a calculated double murder, part of a conspiracy that had corrupted local government and stolen millions of dollars in water rights from family ranchers throughout the region. Emma Morrison found herself at the center of a criminal investigation that validated every suspicion she had harbored for 3 decades. The evidence her brothers had died trying to expose was now in the hands of state and federal investigators who possessed the authority and resources to pursue justice. But Emma discovered that bringing killers to justice after 30 years would prove almost as challenging as uncovering the truth had been. The first arrests came within weeks of the barn fire discovery. Robert Hayes, the former sheriff who had bungled the original investigation, was taken into custody at his Arizona ranch on charges of conspiracy, murder, and obstruction of justice. At 78 years old, Hayes initially maintained his innocence, but the documentary evidence from the hidden basement was overwhelming. Financial records showed he had received regular payments from Western Plains Development throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Hayes's arrest triggered a cascade of revelations as other conspirators attempted to negotiate plea deals. 3 former county commissioners admitted to accepting bribes in exchange for approving illegal water extraction permits. A prominent rancher confessed to participating in the water theft operation and revealed the names of 12 other conspirators. The conspiracy had been far more extensive than even Emma had suspected. The forensic investigation of Jake and Sam's remains provided crucial evidence about their final hours. Both men had been shot with the same .38 caliber pistol a weapon that ballistics experts matched to a gun registered to Western Plains Development for pest control. The brothers had been killed at close range, suggesting they had been lured to a meeting by someone they trusted. Trace evidence on their clothing indicated they had been killed in a basement or underground location before being moved to their concrete tomb. Most importantly, investigators found evidence that Jake and Sam had been tortured before their deaths. Both men showed signs of prolonged restraint and physical abuse, suggesting their killers had attempted to extract information about what the brothers knew and who they might have told. The torture had continued for hours or possibly days before the brothers were finally executed. Emma learned that her brothers had been far more thorough in their investigation than she had realized. The documents found in their concrete tomb revealed that Jake and Sam had been corresponding with federal investigators about the water rights conspiracy. They had been preparing to testify before a grand jury when they were killed. Their murder had effectively ended a federal investigation that might have exposed the entire conspiracy in 1964. The trial of Robert Hayes began in the spring of 1995, 31 years after Jake and Sam Morrison's disappearance. Emma attended every day of proceedings, finally hearing the full story of her brother's final investigation and brutal murder. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Hayes had been the conspiracy's inside man, using his position as sheriff to protect the water theft operation and eliminate threats. According to testimony from co-conspirators seeking reduced sentences, Jake and Sam Morrison had discovered illegal water extraction equipment on their property in September 1964. Instead of immediately confronting the thieves, the brothers had begun a careful investigation, documenting the theft and tracing it back to Western Plains Development. They had discovered that the company was stealing water from dozens of ranches throughout the region. The brothers had made a fatal mistake. They had trusted Robert Hayes with their evidence. As sheriff, Hayes seemed like the natural person to help them build a criminal case against the water thieves. Instead, Hayes had immediately warned his co-conspirators that the Morrison brothers posed a threat to the entire operation. The decision to kill Jake and Sam had been made within hours of their first meeting with the corrupt sheriff. Hayes's testimony, given in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, revealed the cold calculation behind the murders. The conspirators had lured the brothers to a meeting under the pretense of discussing their evidence. Instead, Jake and Sam had been taken to the hidden basement beneath a Western Plains development warehouse, where they were tortured for information about what they knew and who they had told. The brothers had died protecting Emma and their mother. Under torture, they had refused to reveal that they had shared their suspicions with family members or that they had hidden copies of evidence on the ranch property. Their silence had likely saved Emma's life, as the conspirators had intended to eliminate anyone who might continue the investigation. After days of torture failed to break the brothers' resolve, Hayes had personally executed both men with shots to the back of their heads. The bodies had been transported to the Morrison Ranch in the middle of the night, placed in the pre-constructed basement tomb, and sealed beneath concrete and steel. The barn had been built over the gravesite to ensure the brothers would never be found. Emma realized that her 30-year investigation had unknowingly followed the same path her brothers had taken in their final weeks. She had discovered the same evidence, identified the same suspects, and pursued the same theories that had gotten Jake and Sam killed. The difference was that by 1994, most of the original conspirators were dead or too old to pose a physical threat. Robert Hayes was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He died in custody 3 years later, taking additional secrets about the conspiracy to his grave. But his conviction, along with the prosecution of surviving co-conspirators, finally brought a measure of justice to the Morrison family after 3 decades of anguish. The courtroom in Helena, Montana, had become a theater of long-delayed justice, where the ghosts of Jake and Sam Morrison finally found their voices through forensic evidence and the testimony of aging conspirators. Emma Morrison, now 59 years old, sat in the front row every day watching as the truth she had pursued for 30 years was finally laid bare before a jury of her brother's peers. The trial of the remaining conspirators revealed the full scope of the water rights conspiracy that had motivated her brother's murders. Between 1960 and 1980, Western Plains Development and its network of corrupt officials had stolen an estimated $40 million worth of water rights from family ranchers throughout Montana. The Morrison brothers had been killed because their investigation threatened to expose a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for decades. Emma learned details about her brother's final weeks that both comforted and haunted her. Jake and Sam had been meticulous in their investigation, creating detailed maps of illegal water extraction sites, photographing equipment, and documenting financial transactions. They had been building an airtight case against the conspirators when they were betrayed by the very law enforcement official they had trusted to help them seek justice. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Jake and Sam Morrison had been modern-day whistleblowers, risking their lives to expose corruption that was stealing the livelihoods of their neighbors and friends. Their investigation had been sophisticated and thorough, utilizing techniques that wouldn't have been out of place in a federal law enforcement operation. The brothers had died as heroes, defending the rights of family ranchers against corporate theft. But the trial also revealed the extent to which the conspiracy had corrupted their community. 3 generations of county commissioners had taken bribes. Multiple sheriff's deputies had been paid to ignore evidence of water theft. Local judges had dismissed legitimate complaints from ranchers who suspected their water rights were being violated. The Morrison brothers had been fighting a system that was rotten at every level. Emma's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. She described 30 years of investigation, documenting her methodical pursuit of truth in the face of official indifference and community hostility. Her detailed records and tireless advocacy had preserved evidence that might otherwise have been lost, ensuring that her brother's killers would eventually face justice. The defense attorneys attempted to portray the murders as a business dispute that had escalated beyond anyone's intentions. They argued that Jake and Sam Morrison had been killed impulsively during a confrontation about water rights, not as part of a premeditated conspiracy to silence whistleblowers. But the evidence of prolonged torture and the construction of the hidden basement tomb contradicted any claims of spontaneous violence. Emma learned that her mother's instincts had been correct throughout the long years of waiting. Martha Morrison had suspected several of the right people and had correctly identified the conspiracy's existence, even without access to physical evidence. The old woman's faith that her sons would eventually receive justice had been vindicated, though she hadn't lived to see their killers convicted. The financial cost of the conspiracy extended far beyond the Morrison family. Dozens of ranching families had lost their properties because illegal water theft had made their operations unsustainable. Rural communities had declined as family ranches were forced into bankruptcy and sold to corporate interests. The corruption had undermined the economic foundation of the entire region. As the trial proceeded, Emma began to understand the full scope of what her investigation had accomplished. Her 30-year pursuit of truth had not only solved her brother's murders, but had exposed a pattern of corruption that explained the decline of family ranching throughout Montana. Her work had provided justice not just for Jake and Sam Morrison, but for hundreds of families who had been victimized by the conspiracy. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts against all remaining defendants. The sentences were substantial: multiple life terms for those involved in the murders, decades in prison for the corrupt officials who had enabled the conspiracy. At ages ranging from 65 to 81, most of the conspirators would die in prison, finally paying the price for crimes they had escaped for 30 years. Emma felt a complex mix of emotions as the verdicts were read. Justice had finally been served, but the victory felt hollow after 3 decades of loss and struggle. Her brothers were still dead. Her mother had died without seeing their killers punished, and Emma herself had sacrificed any chance of a normal life to pursue the truth. The price of justice had been measured in decades of grief and loneliness, but Emma also felt a profound sense of completion. The promise she had made to her dying mother, that she would never stop searching for answers, had been fulfilled. Jake and Sam Morrison's story was no longer a mysterious disappearance, but a documented case of heroism and sacrifice. Their deaths had meaning, their investigation had been vindicated, and their killers had been brought to justice. The trial's conclusion marked the end of Emma's 30-year investigation, but it also represented a new beginning. For the first time since 1964, she was free to build a life beyond her search for answers. At 59, Emma Morrison could finally grieve properly for her brothers and begin to heal from 3 decades of unresolved loss. The community that had harbored her brother's killers for 30 years now embraced Emma as a hero. But she understood that heroism had been forced upon her by circumstance and loss. All she had ever wanted was to know what happened to Jake and Sam Morrison on that October day in 1964, and to ensure that their killers faced justice. The aftermath of the trials brought both vindication and profound sadness to Emma Morrison, who had spent 30 years of her life pursuing justice for her murdered brothers. The convictions of the conspirators who had killed Jake and Sam Morrison represented the conclusion of one of Montana's longest-running cold cases. But for Emma, the legal victories couldn't restore the decades of life that had been stolen from her family. The media attention following the trials transformed the Morrison case into a national symbol of persistence and the power of family love to overcome corruption and injustice. Emma found herself invited to speak at conferences about cold cases and victims' rights, sharing her story with law enforcement agencies and families of missing persons. But the public recognition felt surreal to a woman who had conducted her investigation in isolation for 3 decades. Emma learned that her brother's case had implications far beyond their individual murders. The water rights conspiracy they had died investigating was part of a broader pattern of resource theft that had occurred throughout the American West during the 1960s and 1970s. Federal investigators used evidence from the Morrison case to reopen dozens of similar cases involving suspicious deaths and disappearances of ranchers who had opposed corporate land grabs. The financial settlements resulting from the criminal convictions provided some measure of compensation for the losses suffered by the Morrison family and other victims of the conspiracy. Emma received a substantial settlement from Western Plains Development's bankruptcy proceedings, money that she used to establish a foundation supporting families of missing persons and funding cold case investigations. But money couldn't restore what had been taken from the Morrison family. Emma was now 60 years old, had never married and had no children. Her entire adult life had been consumed by the search for answers about her brother's fate. The investigation had cost her any chance of building the normal life that Jake and Sam would have wanted for their little sister. Emma returned to the Morrison Ranch property, which she now owned outright, and began the process of deciding what to do with the land where her family had lived and died. The old homestead held too many memories for her to live there comfortably, but she couldn't bear the thought of selling it to strangers who might not understand its significance. She chose to donate the property to the state of Montana for use as a memorial park honoring victims of unsolved crimes. The site would include a visitors center documenting the Morrison case and providing resources for other families seeking answers about missing loved ones. Jake and Sam Morrison's story would serve as both a memorial to their sacrifice and an inspiration for others pursuing justice. The hidden basement where her brother's remains had been found was preserved as part of the memorial, though Emma made sure it was properly consecrated and blessed. She wanted visitors to understand the evil that had been committed there, but also the triumph of truth over deception that had eventually brought her brothers home. Emma also established relationships with the surviving family members of other conspiracy victims. Dozens of ranching families had been affected by the water theft operation, and many had experienced unexplained deaths or disappearances during the 1960s and 1970s. Emma's investigation had provided these families with answers they had never expected to receive. The Morrison case inspired changes in how law enforcement agencies handle missing persons cases, particularly in rural areas where corruption and conflicts of interest can compromise investigations. Emma's methodical documentation techniques became a model for family members conducting their own investigations. When official efforts proved inadequate, Emma found herself grappling with complex emotions about the community that had harbored her brother's killers for 30 years. While some neighbors had been complicit in the conspiracy, others had been victims of the same corruption that had claimed Jake and Sam's lives. She worked to distinguish between those who had actively participated in the cover-up and those who had simply been intimidated into silence. The psychological toll of her 30-year investigation began to manifest as Emma finally allowed herself to process emotions she had suppressed during her single-minded pursuit of justice. She experienced delayed grief for her brothers, anger at the time stolen from her own life, and survivor's guilt over her failure to save Jake and Sam from their fate. Therapy helped Emma understand that her investigation had been both a tribute to her brothers and a form of prolonged mourning that had prevented her from fully accepting their deaths. The discovery of their remains had finally allowed her to complete the grieving process that had been interrupted by uncertainty in 1964. Emma began to rebuild relationships with distant relatives and childhood friends who had drifted away during her years of obsessive investigation. Many expressed admiration for her persistence and dedication, but Emma struggled with the knowledge that her single-minded pursuit of justice had cost her the connections that make life meaningful. As she approached her 61st birthday, Emma Morrison faced a question she had never expected to confront: what to do with the rest of her life now that her brother's case was solved. For 30 years, her identity had been defined by her role as an investigator seeking justice. Now she needed to discover who Emma Morrison was when she wasn't pursuing answers about Jake and Sam's disappearance. The foundation she had established became Emma's new purpose, allowing her to channel her investigative skills and hard-won expertise into helping other families find answers about missing loved ones. She found meaning in using her brother's tragedy to prevent other families from experiencing the decades of uncertainty that had defined her adult life. 5 years after the discovery of Jake and Sam Morrison's remains in the hidden basement beneath their family barn, Emma Morrison stood at the dedication ceremony for the Morrison Memorial Park, watching as officials unveiled a bronze plaque honoring her brother's sacrifice. The autumn wind carried the scent of prairie grass across the Montana landscape, where 3 generations of Morrisons had lived and worked, and where 2 had died defending the rights of their neighbors against corporate greed and official corruption. Emma, now 64 years old, had transformed from an obsessed investigator into a respected advocate for victims' families and missing persons cases. The Morrison Foundation, established with settlement money from the criminal prosecutions, had helped solve 17 cold cases and provided support for hundreds of families dealing with unexplained disappearances. Her brother's deaths had become a catalyst for justice that extended far beyond their individual tragedy. The memorial park encompassed the 50 acres Emma had purchased around the original homestead, including the site where the barn had stood before the fire that revealed her brother's grave. The visitors' center displayed artifacts from the case, documentation of Emma's 30-year investigation, and educational materials about the water rights conspiracy that had motivated the murders. Most importantly, it provided resources for other families pursuing answers about missing loved ones. The preserved basement where Jake and Sam's remains had been found served as a sobering reminder of the evil that corruption can enable, but also as a testament to the power of persistence and truth. Emma had ensured that the site was treated with dignity, while still conveying the reality of what had occurred there. Visitors left flowers and notes, understanding that they were standing in a place where heroism and sacrifice had ultimate meaning. Emma's work with the foundation had brought her into contact with families from across the country who were dealing with unsolved disappearances. She had learned that the Morrison case, while unique in its specific details, represented a pattern of injustice that affected thousands of families every year. Her expertise in conducting independent investigations had become a valuable resource for people who felt abandoned by official law enforcement efforts. The psychological healing that had begun after the trials continued as Emma approached her mid-60s. She had finally been able to properly grieve for Jake and Sam, accepting their deaths while celebrating their lives and their courage in fighting corruption. The anger and obsession that had driven her investigation had been replaced by a quieter determination to honor her brother's memory through service to others. Emma had also begun to rebuild personal relationships that had been neglected during her decades-long pursuit of justice. She had reconnected with childhood friends, developed friendships with fellow advocates, and even begun a romantic relationship with a retired federal investigator who had consulted on the Morrison case. At 64, she was finally learning to balance her commitment to justice with the human connections that give life meaning. The criminal prosecutions resulting from her brother's case had far-reaching implications beyond individual convictions. Federal investigations inspired by the Morrison evidence had exposed similar corruption in 6 other states, leading to dozens of additional prosecutions and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen resources. Jake and Sam Morrison's investigation, completed 30 years after their deaths, had achieved the justice they had died trying to pursue. Emma often reflected on the irony that her brothers had been killed for investigating a conspiracy that she had eventually exposed using many of the same techniques they had employed. The difference was that by the 1990s, forensic science and federal law enforcement resources had evolved to the point where the evidence could be properly analyzed and prosecuted. Jake and Sam had been ahead of their time in their investigative methods, but they had lived in an era when local corruption could overwhelm individual efforts at justice. The community that had once harbored her brother's killers had undergone significant changes in the decades following the trials. New leadership in law enforcement and local government had implemented transparency measures designed to prevent the kind of corruption that had enabled the water rights conspiracy. The Morrison case had become a cautionary tale taught in regional law enforcement academies about the dangers of compromising investigative integrity. Emma's health remained good as she entered her mid-60s, though the stress of her 30-year investigation had taken its toll. She had developed chronic conditions related to decades of anxiety and sleep deprivation, but she considered these a small price to pay for the justice that had finally been achieved. Her doctors marveled at her resilience and determination, understanding that her physical health had been sustained by an unshakable sense of purpose. The legacy of Jake and Sam Morrison extended beyond their individual case to influence how missing persons investigations are conducted throughout the American West. Emma's documentation techniques had been incorporated into training materials for both law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy organizations. Her brother's deaths had contributed to improvements in investigative procedures that would benefit countless other families. As Emma prepared to enter the final phase of her life, she felt a profound sense of completion. The promise she had made to her dying mother, that she would never stop searching for the truth about Jake and Sam's disappearance, had been fulfilled in ways that exceeded anything Martha Morrison could have imagined. The brothers who had vanished in 1964 had finally come home. Their killers had been brought to justice, and their sacrifice had meaning that would endure for generations. The bronze plaque at the Memorial Park bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of the Morrison family's story. In memory of Jake and Sam Morrison, who died defending truth and justice, and Emma Morrison, who never stopped believing that love is stronger than death. Below their names, a final line reminded visitors of the case's ultimate message: some secrets can be buried, but truth will always find a way to the surface. Emma Morrison's 30-year journey from grief-stricken sister to determined investigator to respected advocate had transformed not only her own life, but had created a legacy that would help other families find answers and closure. In the end, the hidden basement that had concealed her brothers' bodies for 3 decades had become the foundation for a memorial that would ensure their story and their sacrifice would never be forgotten. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases like this one. Thank you for following Jake and Sam Morrison's story. We'll see you in the next video.